Smithsonian Associates sponsored lecture, Part 3, presented by Bart D. Ehrman. Christianity's Triumph: How Faith Conquered an Empire. Factors for Christianity's Success.
I want to start this lecture by talking about the first time the first kind of revelation I had about Christianity's triumph. My first thought about the triumph of Christianity, Athens. 20 years ago, I was in Athens. This was my first trip to Athens, and I wanted, of course, to see the antiquities. That's why you go to Athens. I mean, there's a lot of other things to go for, but mainly I work in the ancient world, and so I was interested in the glories of Athens past. So there's this rocky outcrop here that this stands between the Agora down here and the Acropolis up here. And so you can see both from here. Obviously, you can't get an up close sight, but you can see those are the two main areas where you have the most amazing antiquities in Athens, is the Agora, the old marketplace, and then, of course, the Acropolis where the Parthenon and such is. So when you're looking down from here, when you're up here and you're kind of looking down, you can see they've reconstructed this old stoa that was around back in the classical days of Greece, a very large colonnaded place where there were meeting rooms and places to see people and gather together in shops and things. It's a spectacular building that they've tried to reconstruct to make it look pretty much like it did back then in the 5th, 4th century. From the top, you can see this temple to Hephaestus. Hephaestus was the god of fire and volcanoes and metalworking, and this is the single best preserved Greek temple from the ancient world that we have today. Spectacular. 6 columns across, 13 down the side. Inside there were giant statues of Hephaestus, in antiquity, Hephaestus and Athena, the main goddess of Athens. Spectacular temple down there in the Agora. Then you can look up. You can't actually see this from the rocky outcrop, but this is the Erechtheion with these robed female figures that serve as statues, the caryatids. A terrific temple to Poseidon and Athena. And then, of course, the Parthenon. What can you say about the Parthenon? It's the most amazing structure from antiquity that's come down to us. Some people don't know that the way they built the Parthenon is if they had built it so these columns were actually completely straight, it would look curved. And so what they did is there's slight bulges in the middle of the columns, and the columns lean slightly inward, and that gives the illusion of it being a straight line. And so they figured that out, and there were some smart people back there, and the architecture of ancient Greece, and not just the architecture, but the philosophy. This was built before. Plato, Socrates, they hung out up here, and literature, the dramatists, the Greek tragedy, Greek comedy. The arts, it's fantastic what the Greek culture produced. One of the other places I wanted to go in Athens was a place connected with early Christianity. When Paul is the first Christian on record to visit Athens on one of his missionary journeys, according to the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 17, Paul goes to Athens, and he walks around town. He sees all these temples to the gods and all these altars to the gods where they make sacrifices and all. And he found an altar that was dedicated not to Apollo or to Zeus or to Athena, but was dedicated to the unknown God. Now, it's not clear what that's supposed to be all about. But what's often thought is that some Athenian, maybe a lot of Athenians, wanted to make sure that they didn't leave any of the gods out. And so, like, they had gods, temples, and shrine, altars to all these gods, and just in case they missed one, you're the one the unknown God, just that's the one we don't know about. But if you're that one, this is for you, that sort of thing. So Paul preaches. He preaches his Christian message. He has very little success, but there are some philosophers who hear him preach. And Paul's talking about Jesus being raised from the dead. And he talks about the resurrection. And the idea of the resurrection of the flesh is not an idea that most Greek philosophers were comfortable with. In fact, most of them thought this was a disgusting idea. The idea that you're going to be raised and live your life in your body, and like for eternity, you're going to be in your body. Like, this is good news? Really? I'm stuck with this for like eternity? That's good. And Greek philosophers most Greeks didn't think that the eternal life, if it's lived, does have anything to do with the body. So Paul was preaching this, so they kind of rolled their eyes and said, well, let's hear some more from him. And so they invited him to come talk to a group of philosophers, and he went, and they gathered together at a place called the Areopagus, Mars Hill. The Areopagus is in the center of Athens, and Paul goes up on the Areopagus, and he begins to preach to these Epicurean and Stoic philosophers about Jesus and his resurrection, and he has almost no success. They're not really like disturbed by what he has to say, or they're not challenged by it. They're basically just a bit amused. And so he converts one person, maybe two people, and that's kind of it. And so that was it. So this is the Areopagus. It's that craggy hill. That's the Areopagus. You'll notice there are no cultural artifacts on the Areopagus. No buildings, no statues, no altars, nothing. It's a rock. And that's where Paul was. Paul, this lower class Christian preacher who was this outcast, who was despised, who was going around the empire being persecuted and being beat up and being punished, and he has this kind of miserable life from the external, and he goes up here and he has virtually no success, and this is what's standing between the glories of Greece, down below and up above. So I went there. You go up these steps, and you get up there, you get to the top, and you look around, and there's nothing to see. It's just a rock, but you can look up and down. But then I was looking down at the Agora, looking up, seeing the Parthenon from there, and then all of a sudden it hit me. Paul won. He defeated this culture. In the end, Christianity triumphed over Greece, over the glories of pagan Greece. And all of this culture, which is this amazing culture, fell to Christianity. And a lot of that culture we don't have anymore, because Christianity won, and they either destroyed the temples and the altars and the statues, or they just fell apart and they didn't bother to repair them, or the literary works weren't reproduced. I mean, it's like, and Christianity took over and Greece lost. And it just struck me how ironic that on this little craggy hill where this itinerant leather goods worker was, that, I mean, who would have thought that his message is going to take over the Greek-speaking world and the entire Roman Empire? Who would have thought that? Paul probably thought it, but he would have been. But he was the only one. So right. Well, that got me. It was that point that I started thinking. I'd like to write a book about this. So that was 20 years ago, and the thing was that it just seemed to me like such an enormous project that I thought, man, I don't know. So I waited for a while, and so it's just now coming out, as you know. So, what is it that led to Christianity's success? Why did Christianity succeed? Let me go through a number of suggestions that have been made over the years about why it is Christianity ended up taking over the Roman Empire. The old view that virtually all scholars used to have many years ago was that the reason Christianity succeeded is because paganism failed. The logic here is that paganism was a dying set of religions. Nobody believed the myths anymore. They were too ridiculous to be given any credence. The practices were ineffectual, and nobody thought they really were doing any good. And most people weren't very religious at this time, and they were just kind of giving up on religion. Paganism was failing, and along comes superior Christianity with its brilliant monotheism and its strong ethical impulse. And people are drawn to this religion because the other options were so pathetic. So that used to be the view. It's a view many of you have probably heard before, that Christianity filled the vacuum left by the disappearance of the pagan religions, and it's absolutely wrong. It's not true. We know it's not true, for one thing. To begin with, people not believing the myths actually had very little to do with religion. This is a point of confusion for many people. We tend to think ancient religion is all about these myths. You know, you read about these myths in the mythologies, Roman mythology, Greek mythology. And it's true. These stories were floating around in the ancient world, but these were just stories about the gods. Many people thought that these were great fictions. They were entertaining. They didn't really think they happened. But they were just entertaining stories about the gods, but they weren't related to the cultic activities that they're involved with, or just kind of distantly related. So the fact they stopped believing the myths is neither here nor there for the religion. The religion itself was thriving. We know that paganism was thriving because archaeologists have dug things up, and they found that, in fact, temples are being built, they're being populated. It's like there's a lot going on in paganism, and so it's actually a heightened time of religion. So it's not because paganism was failing. That can't really explain it. What about the appeal of monotheism? Now, this is a rather interesting point. Jews, of course, were monotheistic, but Jews weren't particularly interested in converting anybody to their religion. Jews were Jews, and they wanted to practice their traditions, but they didn't care whether you did or not. They just wanted to. There were, as it turns out, other people who were monotheists in the ancient world. In fact, there was a movement toward monotheism even in pagan circles. It's debated whether you should call this movement monotheism or not. There's another word, henotheism, which might be more appropriate. Henotheism is spelled H-E-N-O, theism, henotheism. Henotheism is the belief that there's one superior God who deserves ultimate worship, even though there are other gods. So there are other gods, but there's only one that you're going to worship. That's henotheism. Many people have pointed out that Judaism started out, what we think of as Judaism, started out as henotheistic. You can find this already in the Bible. In the Ten Commandments, you shall have no other gods before me. That presupposes there are other gods. You're just not supposed to worship them ahead of the God of Israel. Right? That's henotheism. The Ten Commandments does not say, I am the only God and you better believe it. It's not that. It's don't have any other gods before me. So there were strands of henotheism, at one point at least, in Judaism. By this time, by the first century, most Jews were probably monotheistic, thinking there really is only one God and the other gods don't really exist. But there was a movement within paganism toward henotheism. We have records of pagans who devoted themselves to the worship of just one God, henotheists. Sometimes this god was identified as Zeus, and he was called Hypsistos Zeus, so the highest Zeus. Or sometimes he wasn't named as any of the gods. He was just called Hypsistos Theos, the highest god. And so there were pagans who were inclined this way, and they were inclined this way in part because every now and then you'd have a pagan group that would adore a particular god or goddess. Apollo, he's fantastic. He's the greatest. He's the most wise. He's the most powerful. He's the most, and if you do that enough, then there's no reason to worship anyone else, right? Because Apollo is the most wise and powerful and great and all that. And so you just worship Apollo then. And sometimes people think then the other gods are actually kind of like manifestations of this one big god, this Hypsistos Theos. The others are just, but there's really only one. And so there is a movement toward And so maybe Christianity appealed to that monotheistic impulse, and that might be true, but that wouldn't say why people are becoming Christians instead of worshipers of hypsistos theos, right? It wouldn't say why Christianity. The attractions of ethics. A lot of people have argued that Christians were notable for being more highly ethical than anyone else, and this would be an attraction. As I said in the Q&A early on, in fact, ancient sources Roman and Greek sources don't say anything about Christians being particularly ethical or that being an attraction. And the irony is that in the wider public, Christians were known to be highly unethical. I mean, in fact, crassly immoral. When you see what pagans say about Christians, the most common rumors about Christians were that they committed incest during their worship services. They were literally orgies happening in their worship services, and that they performed infanticide and cannibalism. They were killing babies and eating them. What? Really? Yeah. These were rumors that we have reported from several sources about the Christians. So the incest thing, it's not quite clear where these ideas come from. One view that some scholars have thrown out is that these Christians, as I said, they're meeting at night. They're meeting when it's dark, before it gets light, for various reasons. And they come together and they call one another brother and sister. And they greet one another with a kiss. So brothers and sisters kissing in the dark, and that's Christian worship. What? That's like, and so, they're committing incest. And part of their service is they eat the flesh and drink the blood of the Son of God. They're killing babies and eating them. And so the Christians' ethics were not known to be superior. They were known to be highly dubious, to say the least. And so I don't think that Christian ethics probably were attracting too many people from what we can tell. We don't have any record of anybody saying, from the outside saying, boy, they're really ethical. I wish I could be like that. In fact, it's just the opposite. This one is attractive to a lot of scholars and a lot of everyone. The benefits of community. This is one that just makes sense. And so that people subscribe to this, not because there's any evidence for it, but just because it makes a lot of sense. And it's this. As I pointed out, in pagan religions, there's no sense of community and fellowship. You don't get together once a week and share your burdens and talk about your problems and support each other and pray for each other and take meals together. And you don't have that kind of family setting within any pagan religions, very few pagan religions. And you get that in Christianity. Wouldn't that be attractive to people? It sure seems like it would be. It seems like it would be. There are a couple things to be said about that. One is that the Christian worship services were not open to anyone. They were closed services. So you couldn't, it's not like today that if you want to go visit the Baptist church, you just go on Sunday morning, you go to the Baptist church, and they welcome you and try and convert you or whatever. You couldn't just like go to the church. The church these are secret meetings for only believers, which means it's hard to know how outsiders would know about how amazing this community was, because they weren't able to see it. It is striking that in all of our discussions about why people convert, there's no reference to people converting because of the community. My sense is that the reason the community was significant is because once somebody joined the community, they found benefits that they didn't get otherwise. There's a difference between having something that keeps somebody in the movement from getting them to join the movement. Right? There's a difference between getting them to stay in than it is to getting them to be in. And so I think the community thing probably helped solidify the Christian movement and helped the community stay intact so that people didn't defect, but maybe that isn't the reason why people joined. Here's one you might not think of: superior health care. Well, actually, you may think about that a lot. Right, but we're not going to go there. There's a scholar I'm going to mention a little bit later again named Kenneth Stark, who wrote a book some years ago now called The Rise of Christianity. It was a very interesting book in a lot of ways. There's one aspect of it I liked a lot. There are many aspects of it I didn't like very much. Rodney Stark is not the person who wrote this book. He's not a historian of ancient Christianity. He's not a historian of the ancient world. He's a modern sociologist of religion. So he does modern religious movements, but he thought he would write something about the rise of Christianity. And one of his controversial claims was that Christianity in part succeeded because of its superior health care. And he actually has a really interesting argument. The argument is that studies have shown that simple nursing improves survival rates when there's an epidemic. Simple, so even if you don't have the medications, you don't have the medicines, but just simple nursing improves survival rates. He points out, so there were several epidemics in the first several centuries of Christianity. There was an epidemic at the end of toward the middle part of the beginning part of the second half of the second century. When Marcus Aurelius was the emperor, there was this epidemic that swept through the empire, and maybe a quarter of the population was killed by this epidemic. Just wiped out a third to a fourth of the population, including the Emperor Marcus Aurelius died of this epidemic. What Stark argues is, he points out that Christian sources say that Christians nursed their sick unlike the pagans. That the pagans just let people die, and Christians nursed their sick. So that Christians are, praising themselves for being more caring for their fellow Christians. And Stark then says, so if that's true, then they nursed, and so more of them survived. So when the epidemic's over, there are more Christians than pagans that survive, and that improves the growth rate. Well, that's an interesting argument. There are two big problems with it. He was raked over the coals for this one, actually, by scholars who are experts in early Christianity, for thinking that if a Christian source says something, it is obviously a fact. So if Christians say, well, we love each other far more than those pagans do. Those pagans, if their mother gets sick, they just leave her to die. Whereas we, so those damn pagans, they don't love any. We love everyone, and so you can't just take sources like that as stating a fact. You've got to look and see whether there's any evidence of it. But so that's one thing. I've got actually a different problem with it, which is this: if Christians were more commonly nursing people who were sick during an epidemic, they would get infected more often. And that's what our Christian sources actually say. We have Christian sources that talk about these epidemics. And what they say is, they do say, unlike those pagans, we nurse our sick. But then they say, and because we nurse our sick, we die right after them. So somebody will be nursing somebody, and the next day they'll be carried out. And so the mortality rate is higher among the Christians, because if it's true they're nursing the sick. And so I don't think this argument really ends up giving you very much. As I said in my last lecture, I think it's because of the power of God. It's these people were convincing others that the God of the Christians was more powerful than the pagan gods, and this proved convincing. That's what's said in all of our sources, and it makes good sense if you know anything about paganism. But why Christianity in particular? All the religions are saying that their gods are doing miracles. So I don't want to leave the impression that Christians are saying our God does miracles and your gods do not. All the pagans think their gods are doing miracles, and Christians are saying their God is doing miracles. So why is Christianity succeeding? That's the question. And this, for me, is the real key, these next 2 points. First, evangelism. Christians tried to convert others to their faith, and no other religion that we know about was doing that. It might seem natural that religions try to convert people, but the reason that seems natural is because Christianity became the religion of the West, and we all grew up in the West, and in the West, you have that kind of religion, and it's an evangelistic religion. Christianity, historically, has tried to convert people. But in the polytheistic religions, there was no reason to convert people. Suppose you are an advocate of Apollo. Apollo is your god. You worship Apollo. You adore Apollo. Apollo does miracles for you. Apollo's fantastic. You might tell your next door neighbor, actually, I worship Apollo. He could do you a lot of good. Oh, okay, yeah, maybe I will. But it's like you have no compulsion to try to convert him, because his eternal life doesn't depend upon it. It'd be a nice thing if you wanted to. So you don't have pagan missionaries out there trying to convert anybody. If you do convert somebody, it's just they start worshiping this new god, but they've got their own gods, and so everybody's all worshiping the gods. Christians, on the other hand, were evangelistic. Why? What was the incentive? It's a little bit odd, but the answer is we don't really know. The sources never come out and say why. They only give hints. And the way I read the hints is that there are two factors involved that worked hand in hand. The first is Christians did have this ethic that they were supposed to love their neighbor as themselves. Now, I'm not saying that Christians were more loving than anyone else, but I am saying that they talked about loving one another more than anyone else. This is like part of what they were all about. They have to love one another. They need to love their neighbor as much as themselves, which means you need to be concerned about the welfare of other people. Well, if you're concerned about the welfare of a person, and you know that when this person dies, they're going to roast in hell forever, you need to convert them. It's just part of it, because if you've got both the idea you've got to love and the idea of heaven and hell, that drives the missionary impulse of Christians. I think it's that combination of things, which you obviously don't get that in the pagan religion. So that's the incentive. The modus operandi is very interesting. How did Christians do it? So, they couldn't set up a Twitter account or do this on Facebook. They couldn't do it through mass media of any kind because most people couldn't read. At this time, probably something like 80 to 85% of the population was illiterate of the Roman Empire, 80 to 85% illiteracy rate. How do you convert people? There is very little evidence that people were going into a public square and standing on a soapbox and starting to preach. Very little evidence of that. And even more interesting, this is something I didn't expect going into my research for this book. We have almost no evidence of Christian missionaries after Paul. Almost no evidence. For the time period I'm talking about, say for the first 300 years of Christianity, we know the names of 2 missionaries who have any missionary stories connected with them. 2. For a period of 300 years after, 3 counting Paul. After the New Testament period. 2 people that we know about. One of whom was a guy named Gregory, who's called Gregory the Miracle Worker, because he was going around in a part of what's now Turkey, and he was doing miracles and converting people by doing his miracles. Gregory the Miracle Worker at the end of the early 3rd century. Somewhat later, there was a guy named Martin of Tours who was in Gaul who did miracles and converted people. Those are the 2 people we know about. There's no organized mission. So you don't have like missionary activities where people are chosen and they go out afield and none of that. Well, then how's it working? It's happening by word of mouth through social networks. Social networks. So all of us are in a large number of social networks. You have a large number of social networks, which means all of the people you come in contact with in various parts of your life. So you come in contact with people in your family, in your neighborhood. You know your neighbors. You see people at the store. You see people at sporting events. You see people in your local club. You see people if you belong to a religious organization. You see people at work. You see people connect with your kids at school. I mean, you see people. And sometimes these people that you see in various contexts, sometimes you'll see the same person in various contexts. Sometimes you just see one person in one context. So you see somebody in one context, they have social networks, including the one with you, maybe a couple with you, but then they have other ones. And they have connections with people, and one of these people they're connected with has social networks, and sometimes they overlap with yours, and sometimes they're unrelated to yours. And so like the networks spread out fairly quickly. Christianity appears to have spread through social networks as people would tell the stories that would lead to conversion. Paul converts somebody. Suppose he converts the head of a household, a man. The man has a wife. The man talks to the wife and convinces her also to start worshiping the Christian God. The wife talks to the next door neighbor. The next door neighbor comes to believe after a period of months. She tells her cousin who converts, and her cousin tells her husband, and her husband tells his business associate. His business associate travels over somewhere else and it goes like that. It's by word of mouth through social networks. It's not by missionaries or by evangelists. Everybody's an evangelist who's trying to tell others about this good news that they know. And so it's through social networks by word of mouth, one person at a time. So that is the first important factor for why it's Christianity and not some other religion, because only Christianity is trying to convert people. And the second one is really important. Exclusivity. The Christians were the only ones saying, our religion is right and yours is wrong. The other religions didn't do that. They're polytheists. They know there are many gods. You can worship gods any way you want, however you should. I mean, not any way you want. You worship them in the accepted ways of worshiping the gods. But you worship this God that way, I worship my God that way. And I will also worship this God. And if you want me to worship your God, I'll start worshiping your God. But when I start worshiping your God, I don't stop worshiping my gods. And so in pagan religions, it's all embracing and it's tolerant of difference. Christians were not all embracing and they were not tolerant. If you worship the God of Jesus, you can no longer worship Zeus or Apollo or Athena or Artemis or any of the others or your household gods, or you can't worship the other gods. It's exclusive. This ends up making the difference in the spread of Christianity. Let me explain how. Now, I'm going to give you a hypothetical situation that never would have happened. Suppose I and another fellow, you all are ancient pagans, so there are 200 of you who are ancient pagans, and this fellow who comes in is an advocate for the god Apollo, and I'm an advocate for the God of Jesus. Okay? So this would never happen, but suppose two of us were preaching to this crowd of 200 people. And none of you worships Apollo, and none of you worships the God of Jesus. You're pagans, but you don't worship Apollo or the God of Jesus. Suppose this guy and I are equally successful, and each of us convinces half of you. Okay? If that happens, paganism loses 100 of you and gains no one. Christianity gains 100 of you and loses no one. Christianity is destroying the other religions in its wake, and it's the only religion doing it. Give that again. The pagans lose 100 and gain no one. The Christians gain 100 and lose no one, and Christianity is the only religion doing that. You do that long enough, and paganism starts to disappear. Well, I think that's the real key. So now let me tell you how I think it actually happened. How fast did Christianity grow? How fast did it happen? So I've been arguing that maybe it started out with 20 people. It doesn't matter to me whether you like that number 20, whether you think the number is 5, or whether you think the number is 30. Look, it's not going to be much lower than 10, and it's not going to be much higher than 30. I'm talking about the people who first became to believe in Jesus' resurrection. I doubt if it's 20, but let's just say it's 20. It's not going to matter, as you're going to see. It's somewhere in there. The typical scholarly number is that by the year 300, there are 5 or 6 million Christians in the world. That is a number that goes back for over a century to a scholar named Adolf von Harnack, who is a German scholar, who looked at every literary reference to where Christianity existed in the year 300. And he crunched the numbers, he calculated it, and he came up to 5 or 6 million. But I think that there are reasons for suspecting that that's too many. One reason for suspecting it's too many is because I think he underestimated how concentrated the population of the empire was in rural areas. There were far more people in the countryside than in the cities. And so you have evidence for Christians in the cities, but not so much in the countryside. And so I don't have an exact number to throw out, but I'm just saying, look, it's probably too much. Just suppose you cut it in half. Again, it's not going to matter. It's weird. It's kind of weird, but it's not going to matter very much. But just suppose he's off by 100%. Just cut it in half. 2 to 3 million people in the year 300. My question is, how do we get from here to there? Again, how do you get from 20 people, say, to 2 or 3 million? Most scholars who worked on this problem have simply assumed that there's no way to get there unless you have massive conversions. How else are you going to get 3 million people? You've got to have a lot of people converting, and so you need like Billy Graham rallies, right? Where people come forward and commit their life to Christ, and it's like you've got to have hundreds at once and thousands, and it's got to be mass conversions. That's what virtually everybody thought until Rodney Stark came along. Rodney Stark, who's a sociologist. Now, as I said, Rodney Stark, he's not a historian of ancient Christianity, but he is a sociologist, and nobody can crunch numbers better than a sociologist. They can calculate population growth. That's what they do for a living. And he crunched the numbers, and he came up with a really interesting result. He said, he worked it out somewhat differently. He said, okay, suppose in the year 40, there are 1,000 Christians in the world. Okay? So say there are 1,000 Christians by the year 40. And let's say that there are 6 million by the year 300. How do you get 1,000 in the year 40 to 6 million in the year 300? He plots it out. What you need is a growth rate of 40% every decade. Every decade, your religion has to grow by 40%. In other words, if there are 100 of us here who are Christian, in 10 years, there need to be 140 of us. That's not implausible. That means 3 or 4 people a year. You convert 3 or 4 people a year, on average 3 or 4% a year. And if you're in the ancient world, if you convert the head of the household is the paterfamilias, the head of the household, and he's the one who determines the religion of his family. So that if you got the man, you convert the man, and he makes his wife and his children convert, and they start going to church, and after a while they actually even start believing. You've converted 4 people by converting 1. You just have to do that once a year. The 100 of you have to convert 1 head of a household. That's it. And you do that over time, and it becomes big because of an exponential curve. You know, if there are 100 of you and you only need to convert 4 a year, well, if there are 1,000 of you, then you convert the same rate, you convert 40 a year. And if there are 10,000, it's 400 a year. If it's 100,000, by the time you're up to 1 million or 2, you're talking about masses of conversions every year at the same rate. And so it's an exponential curve. It's an exponential curve. It's like your investments. You know, not now, but but before last week, at the same rate, you had that money in there all those years, and all of a sudden you're making money hand over fist, even though it's the same rate. It's because you've got more dollars in there, so it's earning. So it's the same thing. The interesting thing about this 40% decade thing, Rodney Stark points out that was the rate of growth of the Mormon church from the time it was founded until the time he was writing. It grew at a rate of 43% per decade, which I think means in 200 years, we'll all be Mormon. So I have some problems with his numbers. And so in my book, I tweak the numbers. I mean, it's kind of tweaking, but there are some kind of serious things. For one thing, how does he get to 1,000 Christians in the year 40? So if the New Testament's right that you start off with 20 in the year 30, if you got to 1,000 by the year 40, that'd be a growth rate of 4,900%. So are we supposed to think that for 26 decades after that, it was at a growth rate of 40%? But that for the first decade, it was 4,900%? That doesn't seem right. On the other hand, it couldn't have just grown at 40% that first decade, or two or three. It couldn't have just grown at 40% because if it only was growing at 40%, by the year 60, you'd have only 55 Christians in the world. That can't be right because in the year 60, Paul has written to churches in Philippi, Thessalonica, Corinth, Galatia. He knows of churches in Rome and Antioch and Jerusalem. There are something like 48 churches mentioned in Paul's letters. So, and obviously there's more than one person in each of these churches. So there's got to be more than 55. So it's got to go at a faster rate than that early on anyway. So I tried to come up with some more plausible calculations, and it's really just tweaking. I think that probably early on there's an initial burst because everybody thinks Jesus is going to come back very soon, and so they're very enthusiastic in converting people. But that over time it starts tapering off, especially toward the end. There are ebbs and flows in conversion. It's not happening at a steady rate, obviously. Some years you have good years, some years not so good. There are going to be slower rates at the end. There have to be slower rates at the end. If there weren't slower rates, if it continued growing at 40, suppose it grew at 40% a decade up to the year 300. If it continued growing at a rate of 40% a decade after the year 300, then by the year 400, there'd be 170 million Christians out of a population of 60 million people. So it can't grow there. There aren't enough people. The reason the rate slows is because there are fewer people to convert. Right? As you get more conversions, there are fewer pagans, and so the rate's going to slow down. So anyway, I calculate all that, and in my book I come up with an exponential curve that this is the chart that I do in the book. So, I mean, at that rate, the rates that I calculate are, I give them in the book. There's no point in my giving them here, but basically it ends up that it seems in terms of pure numbers, you're converting almost nobody. You are converting people, but it's like 3 or 4 people a year. Over the years, but then once your numbers start getting bigger, then all of a sudden, boom, it just takes off because of the exponential curve. It's how math works. So I calculate the numbers and I round them off because it's obviously ridiculous to talk about absolute numbers. But let me tell you the numbers that I come up with in my book. And then the significance of those numbers. So I say we start off with 20 Christians in the year 30, and at the rates that I calculate, by the year 60, I think by the exact numbers, it's 1,280 Christians, but who knows? But just say between 1,000 and 1,500 is a plausible guess for what you've got by the time Paul is writing his last letter in the world, 1,000 to 1,500 Christians in the world. By the year 100, at these rates, about 7,000 to 10,000 Christians. 150, about 30,000 to 40,000. So you see, these are at basically the same rate, but because the numbers are increasing, the more conversions are increasing. By 200, maybe 140 to 160,000 Christians, so say 150,000 maybe. 250, 600,000 to 700,000. The year 300, by my calculations, you're at either from 2.5 to 3.5 million, so say 3 million. By the time Constantine converts, between 3.5 and 4 million Christians in the world. By the year 400, between 25 and 35 million Christians in the world, about half the population. These are guesstimates, but there are some guesses that are better than others. Some are educated guesses and some are ignorant guesses. And these are meant to be educated guesses. I find this kind of interesting. I actually, in my book, I had this chapter where I explained how to crunch the numbers. And I got really into this number thing. And I had this chapter, and I showed the book to a number of my friends. Whenever I write a book, I show it to colleagues in the field who can tell me what I've gotten wrong and kind of correct everything for me and stuff. So I do that. So I gave the book to like 4 or 5 people to read for me who are experts in the field. And every one of them said, "God, that chapter's boring." I said, no, it's great because you got these numbers, and you're doing this kind of, it's this, this exponential curve. And I was explaining, he said, yeah, okay, whatever. So I said, okay, no, I'm keeping it. So I sent it into my editor, and my editor read it. She really liked the book. She loved the book. And she said, but chapter 6 is boring. I said, no, I don't want to give up chapter 6. And she said, look, here's what you do. Just explain the basics in the chapter and give the numbers, and then crunch the numbers in an appendix. Just make it an appendix, so if anybody is a number geek, they can go to the appendix and figure out like how it actually works and just do it that way. And I thought that's brilliant. That way I get to keep the chapter, but nobody has to read it. So, okay, so I want to talk for a second about some implications of these numbers. Just 2 implications that strike me as particularly interesting if this number thing if the number thing is right. Of course, if this number thing isn't right, some other number thing has to be right. And these implications actually are going to be pretty similar no matter what numbers you crunch in. First, the historical and cultural impact of Christianity. I have been insisting that in terms of the overall history of Western civilization, the triumph of Christianity is enormously important. But how important was it at the time? How significant was Christianity at particular moments of ancient history? Whoops. Oh, there we go. I've looked at a couple points. The year 100. If I'm right that there are 7,000 to 10,000 Christians in the world, how much of the Roman Empire is that? Well, it's actually 0.0167%. That is, it's 1/60th of 1% in the year 100. Now, wait a second. When we tend to think of it, we tend to think like Christianity is like becoming this major force in the world. No, it's not becoming a major force in the world. It's nowhere near 99% of the population, nowhere near 1% of the population. Most people have never heard of the vast majority of people have never heard of Christianity. Well, go 100 years later, 200. 200 CE, Christianity is starting to be a threat to the empire, right? Aren't the emperors starting to get worried about this? Probably not. It's 1/4 of 1% of the population. Again, nowhere even near 1%. 99, wow, that's the year 200. But at the same rate of growth, by the year 300, it makes up about 5% of the population. Still, it's only 5% of the population. When Constantine converts, it's not that everybody else is converting and that that he's kind of jumping on the bandwagon. There's not much of a bandwagon yet. But then it's this number. It's like by the end of by 400, it's about 50% of the population. One of my theses in my next lecture is that the conversion of Constantine didn't do it because the growth rates are slowing at this point. They're not speeding up. They have to slow down because if they sped up, there'd be more Christians than people in the world. So the rates are slowing down. So it's not that Constantine is suddenly bringing in the masses. In fact, the conversion rates are slowing down. But at this point, if you just in terms of the historical and cultural significance of Christianity, I would say that, in fact, for most of this period, Christians are completely insignificant. they're not making much of an impact. Okay, so there's that. Now there's something else that is kind of interesting. It's unrelated to any of that. Suppose in the period between, how do I want to do this? Suppose in the period between the year 50 and the year 150, in that period, suppose on average there's 200 churches in the world at the time. Okay, so that's not a bad estimate. If there are about 8,000 Christians and a big house can hold 40 people, and you're about 8,000 people, so does that work? Something like that. Anyway, it's 200. Yeah, 200 churches and 40 people. That makes sense for that period between 50 and 150. All right. Now, here's what I want to say though. Suppose that our evidence is right that it appears that Christian churches liked writing letters to one another. So in the New Testament, you have all these letters, and churches communicated. It's one thing that made Christians different from pagans. Pagans didn't have there was no worldwide religion of Zeus or Apollo or Athena or any. There were localities that had religions, but if you worship Athena in Athens, somebody else worships Athena in Ephesus, you've got nothing to do with each other. You don't see yourselves as part of a worldwide thing. You're just different communities. Christians saw themselves as a worldwide community. And that's why they communicated with each other and shared their problems and talked about the issues and wrote letters to each other. So let's just say, most people, of course, are illiterate. If you've got 40 people in your church and 10% could read, then 4 people can read. So you got 4 people can read and write, but that's okay because when somebody writes a letter to your church, individuals don't read it. Somebody reads it out loud in the worship service. And so everybody reads it by hearing it read. And so people are sending letters. You got 4 people who can read, you send letters. How often you send letters? I don't know. Suppose you send a letter every 3 months to another church. Okay? Suppose all the churches, just say once every 3 months. So they're not writing letters every day, but suppose once every 3 months. So 4 times a year. In that period between 50 and 150, if you've got 200 churches on average, each of them writing 4 letters a year, crunch the numbers. There would have been 80,000 Christian letters written during that period. We have 50. Whoa. That is completely plausible. 80,000 letters by Christians that we don't have. We have 50 of them. So the amount of stuff that's been lost just boggles the mind. Absolutely boggles the mind. All right, whoops. So my point is Christianity is spreading through social networks as people convince other people that the Christian God is more powerful than the pagan gods. They don't have to convince a lot of people. They don't have to convince 50 people at once or 10 people at once. They need to convince 3 or 4 people a year. 100 people need to convince 3 or 4 more people a year. And since we're talking about a situation where a paterfamilias determines the religion of the family, then you just need to convert a paterfamilias. Once you, the 100 of you need to convert one. And you just do that year after year after year. And every time you convert somebody or for somebody, you take them into Christianity and out of paganism. And over time, it ends up destroying paganism because Christianity is the only religion that's both exclusivistic and evangelistic, and that ends up making all the difference. Thank you very much. I've left time for questions. Yes?
I have a question about persecution. Given that the numbers of Christians were so low, how did Nero and Domitian find any persecutors?
I'm going to be talking about the persecutions in the next lecture. So I will be talking precisely about that. And so, thank you, yes. But, I'll talk about it in the next lecture. Yes?
So the contemporaries of the early Christians had these wild ideas of the heinous rituals that Christians engaged in. Fast forward a little bit, and you've got Christians tarring the Jews with the same sort of fables. Is that a coincidence or human nature, or is there
Yeah.
a historical?
So the question is, Christians are being accused of scandalous activities. Later, Christians accuse Jews of scandalous activities, similar activities, and is that an accident? As it turns out, it was very common in the ancient world to attack a group that you didn't like by saying that they were sexually immoral, that they held orgies, and that they killed babies and ate them. That was a common charge. So you actually have pagans talking about other pagan groups doing this. You've got Christians saying that this happened. Let me think for a second. You've got a source in Rome. Livy reports this. The Livy historian, Roman historian Livy reports about the Bacchanalia, the Dionysiacs in Rome in 142 BCE, who are said to have these kind of wild nocturnal things where they're committing ritual murder and stuff, and they're a big threat to the empire, and so there's the slander against them. You get pagans against pagans. You get pagans making these charges against Christians. You have pagans making it against Jews. There's a rumor that Josephus reports, the Jewish historian Josephus reports, where he says that there was this rumor in Greek circles that the Jews in Jerusalem every year would capture a Greek and imprison him in the Jewish temple and make him eat a lot, fatten him up, and then after a year would sacrifice him and eat him. And so Jews had to defend themselves against that. So, and then later Christians make all sorts of charges against Jews for blood libel and stuff. So, so it's not an accident. This is, if you wanted to defame somebody, these are kind of the standard terms that you use. Yeah.
And you talked about the role of evangelism and exclusivism and the similarity in the growth rate between Christians and Mormons. Did you add the growth of Islam into that?
The growth of Islam. Yeah, I don't know what the statistics are for the growth of Islam, and I don't really know if it's happening the same way. My sense is that it's not happening exactly the same way, but what the rates are, I don't know. Maybe other people probably do know, but my sense is that in a lot of places Islam was growing very quickly, as opposed to it 3 or 4% a year. But I might be wrong about that. I really don't know. Sorry. Yes, first you, then you. Yeah.
When you're talking about the world, you're talking about the Western world, west of Persia.
I'm talking about the Roman Empire. Yeah, I'm not talking about China or anything like that.
There were some contacts during that time.
So, yeah. Well, there are legends about he's saying where there are other parts of the world besides the Roman Empire that's being affected by Christianity. And there are certainly legends that you start getting in the 2nd century about Christians taking the message further east, especially, everybody knows about Thomas, the missionary to the Indians, for example, which again is a legendary account. Even though some people in India say, Thomas really came here and started this, it's all based on 2nd century legends that are found in one of the Apocryphal Acts. There's an Apocryphal Act called the Acts of Thomas, where Thomas is said to be a missionary to India. This is Thomas. This isn't the Thomas who's found in the Gospel of John. This is Thomas who's actually Jesus' brother, Thomas. So it's a really intriguing story in this Acts of Thomas. The word Thomas means twin. The word Thomas means twin. And in the Acts of Thomas, this Thomas figure, his name is actually Judas Didymus Thomas. So it's Jude, Jesus' brother Jude, Thomas, Judas Thomas. This Judas Thomas is called the twin because he's Jesus' twin. And he's not just his twin, he's his identical twin. Which leads to some very interesting questions one might have. The way this, I'll answer those questions in a second, but the way it plays out in the narrative is there's one scene where, Thomas is on the way to India, and they're stopping off someplace, and they stop to refuel the boat or whatever, to resupply the boat, and they show up in a city, and the king of the city's daughter's getting married, and this is a text. This is one of those Christian texts that emphasized the virtues of celibacy, and that for salvation you have to be celibate. And so Thomas is invited as an outside guest to come to this wedding, and he goes to the wedding, and instead of like praising the couple like everyone else, he urges them not to do it. And they get married, and they ask for his blessing, and he tries to get them not to consummate the wedding, consummate the marriage. And he has no luck, and so they kind of kick him out. And the bride and groom go into the bridal chamber, and sitting on the bed is Thomas. They just talked with him. He just left. But it's actually Jesus now, but he looks just like Thomas. Jesus has come down to heaven to try his hand at it. And the Son of God is more effective than his twin brother. And so he convinces them not to consummate the marriage. The next day, the king and the queen come in, and they say, well, how'd it go? I say, well, yeah, we decided not to have sex because, we want to have eternal life. And so they get all angry, and they decide they have to go out and execute Thomas, but he's taken sail, and Jesus gone back to heaven. And so, but the whole point of this thing is that they're twins, right? They look alike, and so so you wonder how could that work exactly? I mean, if the mother is a virgin, how and Jesus is born of the virgin, what's Thomas? And so we don't know the answer to that. These traditions were circulating in Syria. They were circulating in ancient Syria, is where these Thomas traditions originated. And my guess is that they are playing off a theme that you find in ancient mythology, Greek and Roman mythology. So, sorry, I'm taking a long time on this, but it's worth it. There's a Roman playwright named Plautus. Have you ever heard of Plautus? He's a comic playwright. Writes very funny plays. For years, I refused to read anything by Plautus because my brother wrote his Ph.D. dissertation on Plautus, and I thought if my brother likes him, he can't be that good. But then I decided to read Plautus, and it's fantastic. He has this play called the Amphitryon. Amphitryon is the name of a general in the army who has gone off to war, who has left his gorgeous wife Alcmene back home, who's pregnant. He's left her pregnant back home. She's drop dead gorgeous. And Jupiter looks down from heaven, and he sees Alcmene, and he says, I want to have sex with her. So what's he going to do? Well, he takes on the appearance of Amphitryon. So he becomes the double of Amphitryon. He comes down, and he convinces her that he's come back from war. She welcomes him with open arms. They go to bed. They have such a great time. Jupiter has such a great time in bed with Alcmene that he stops the constellations from moving. In other words, he makes time stand still. So this is a very long night. And so finally Jupiter gets his fill, and he starts the constellations, and he goes back to heaven. And it turns out the next morning, Amphitryon comes back from war. And he doesn't understand why his wife doesn't welcome him with open arms. I mean, she's just like spent a very long night in his arms. But she had been pregnant by Amphitryon to begin with, and then Jupiter got her pregnant as well. Okay, so they're not big on anatomy and how all that, but we're talking about gods and things. And so she has twins. One of them is the son of Jupiter. That's Hercules. That's who Hercules is. And the other is his twin brother, Iphicles, who was immortal. So you get an immortal and an immortal. And so what were these Syrian Christians thinking about Thomas and Jesus and twins and things? My guess is that they thought that Joseph got Mary pregnant and that God got her pregnant. So Jesus was born of a virgin, not by sex, and he had a twin brother. That's just my guess. All right, that has nothing to do with your question. Yes. Yeah, okay, yeah.
So when someone converted then,
Yeah.
what does that actually mean?
I'm sorry.
What did they do? What were the in the year 100, what were the actual?
Yeah, okay, yeah. So what, I mean, the ideal thing, if somebody converts, what happened? What do they actually do? And one reason it's hard to know realistically what happened is because in our accounts, you know, they have this kind of blind flashing moment where they convert and they commit their lives to Christ, but, you know, they don't know anything about Christ yet. So where are they committing themselves to? And they don't, you know, and so like realistically, it's kind of hard to know. But my sense is that most people aren't converting on the spot because they see a miracle. They hear something, they think about it, they talk and they talk and they talk and they talk, and a few months later they have some idea of what this is, and they decide. And I think the ideal conversion in this situation is they give up their other gods, they stop worshiping the other gods, and they commit to worship the God of Jesus, and they start getting together once a week with the other Christians, and they get baptized, and they start taking the meal every week, and they join the community. A lot of people may not have actually gone through all of that, but a lot of people probably did. Yes. Did you have a question? It was asked. Okay. Yes.
Speaking of the East earlier, India, Syria, and the earlier point about Islam,
Yeah.
any thoughts on what might have been attractive about Christianity or Christian features, emphasis on Jesus, Mary, Abraham, Moses? What components of Christianity, even if it was a cultural Christianity, what would have attracted to Islam? Any thoughts on that?
What would have attracted people connected with Christianity to Islam? Is that the question?
Or the spread of Islam as a faith with many Christian elements, such
Yeah.
Jesus,
Yeah.
Abraham, Moses.
I'm not really qualified to talk about Islam, and so I tend to only talk about things I know about. So I know about one day's worth of stuff. It's kind of what I know. Okay, I'll take one of them. Yes, in the back. In the back first, yeah. Oh, just say, okay. I don't care. I'll take both of you, but one at a time. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, I wonder if you could comment on a couple things. I don't know if I've read it or heard it. One is that when Alexander, he didn't make it back to the Middle East, but his people, when they came back, they brought back the idea of the transmigration of souls from India. And the second thing is I've read or heard that at one point a lot of pagans were converting to Judaism because it had a body of, if you were in the Greek world, you could satisfy one God, the other God would be angry with you, there wasn't a way to live a good life. So in Judaism, you have that stuff all lined up. And then when Constantine made a capital offense, they stopped trying to convert people.
Okay, yeah, great. Did everybody hear the questions? No. The first question, was that when Alexander the Great was conquering, he went as far as modern-day India. And the question is, did he and his troops, he died on the route back, but did his troops bring back the idea of the transmigration of the soul from eastern climes? And the answer to that is probably not. We have the idea of transmigration of the soul, in other words, reincarnation. We have that already in Greek philosophical traditions a couple centuries before Alexander. And so it's usually connected with Pythagoras. And so probably it was already resident in Greek thinking at the time. The other question was, were there pagan conversions to Judaism on the theory that in paganism, so since you have so many gods, if you worship one, then maybe this other one gets ticked off at you, and then you worship him, and then that one gets ticked off at you, and and so with Judaism, you don't have that problem. You got one God. And so would that lead to large conversions? And about that, I'll say, the thing about paganism is that it doesn't look like the gods got angry. One God didn't get angry if you worship some other God. That wasn't an issue, so far as we can tell. And so I don't think that would have been a compelling thing. Were there pagans who were attracted to Judaism? I think the answer is almost certainly there must have been. There must have been people who found this attractive. They might have been drawn to the monotheism, the ancient traditions they had. And we don't have record, though, of very many conversions. We don't have record of it. And a lot of people talk about, even scholars have this category that they call the God-fearers. I don't know if you've heard this category, the God-fearers, who are pagans who go to the synagogue and participate in the worship of the God of Israel, but they don't go all the way in keeping all of the law, right? They don't get circumcised and they don't keep the kosher and stuff, but they worship the God of Israel, and so they're kind of halfway there, so they're called God-fearers. And there are other scholars like me who think that category is either completely made up by modern scholars or blown way too big. We don't have good evidence, actually, for that category either. There have been a lot of studies on whether Judaism was a missionary religion or not, whether it was trying to convert people. And the best study of this is by a guy who's a scholar of early Judaism at Oxford named Martin Goodman, who has a book on mission, the concept of mission in ancient religion. And he argues that there's almost no record of, well, there is no record. There's no evidence of Jewish mission at the time. The Jews just, they weren't interested in converting people. Yes, in the back.
At some point, Christianity converted from a movement to a hierarchy, including collecting money and paying clergy. And how did that happen? How did those leaders emerge? The clergy?
Yeah, how did the clergy emerge? Well, Christianity, because once Christianity is growing, they start developing a hierarchy, and being the leader of a church was your day job. And how did all that happen? That's kind of a long story. The earliest Christian churches we know about are the ones connected with Paul. Paul's churches don't have leaders in them, per se. In Paul's churches, you find out that Paul talks about the most about this in 1 Corinthians, especially chapters 12 through 14, where he indicates how the church works, which is everybody in the church is believed to have a gift given to him or her by the Holy Spirit. When a person is baptized, the Spirit gives the person a specific gift. So some are gifted to be evangelists, some are gifted as teachers, some are gifted as administrators, some are gifted as healers, some are gifted to be able to speak prophecies. Some people speak in foreign tongues they've never learned. Other people know how to interpret those tongues. These aren't abilities, these are gifts that are given. And the idea is, for Paul's idea is that the end is coming sometime very soon, in a matter of months, maybe. And so you just need a short period of time to organize the church, and the Spirit organizes it by giving people all these spiritual gifts. The problem is the end doesn't come, and the months turn into years, and the years turn into decades, and there's nobody in charge. And chaos erupts. And so what naturally happens is leaders emerge. And so by the end of the first century, you start finding churches that have bishops or overseers and presbyters and deacons, and they have these kind of church offices. By the time you get to the end of the second century, it looks like some of these people are doing this. They're being supported by the church to do this, and it moves then into the 4th and 5th century. You end up having bishops in major churches, and Rome ends up being the most major of the major churches. So the bishop of Rome becomes sort of like the bishop for the entire church, and he becomes the pope. That takes several centuries for that to happen, but it starts out because these charismatic communities simply can't function, and they need to have leadership. And so they follow models from the Greek and Roman worlds of what you do with communities. You have certain kinds of hierarchical leadership. So that's it. Okay, my time is up. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and then we will hit the climax with Constantine.